Good morning, it's Diane Sare, and as a prelude to the symposium later this evening, my campaign is hosting an urgent strategic update because we really are careening toward thermonuclear war, I'm sorry to say, and I'm joined by two very important guests, military experts, Colonel Senator Richard Black and Scott Ritter, who I will allow them to tell you a little bit about themselves. Before I get too far, let me also say that participation in a Sare for Senate dialogue does not constitute endorsement of a political campaign, and the views expressed by my guests are their own and my own, but we need to get something done urgently, and the American people are going to have to respond and mobilize. Now, I wanted to say a few things by way of introduction, give you some background on the situation. I have some slides that I'm going to be showing just to get some things out of the way, because I'm hoping that many of the people listening are people who are not that familiar with the situation, or who maybe think that Russia is the aggressor in this, etc. I'm hoping that we're going to dispense with a lot of that disinformation. I'd also like to say right at the start that all three of us are on a kill list. The Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation released a list on July 14th of 72 individuals. It has since been removed from their website, probably didn't look that good for them, but that list has served as a source for another kill list on the Mirotvorets website, where I understand another journalist has been badly injured in an attack, Adrian Bouquet. I don't know if either of you know him. At any rate, he's in the hospital now in Turkey. So this is extremely serious. The US Congress has voted to fund this operation, and I think it underscores the Nazi-infested nature of the Ukrainian regime, which is being used by NATO, the US, UK, to bludgeon Russia. Now, what I actually wanted to start with, because I've been really thinking about what just happened with Nord Stream 2, and how it is that the United States could be involved in activities that are so very destructive. I'm not going to say definitively that the United States was involved in the sabotage of the pipeline, but I find it very hard to imagine that this could have happened without US at least approval, if not direct involvement. What I'm going to read from is something that Lyndon LaRouche put out September 15th, 2001, 4 days after the 9/11 attacks, and I think you'll see why. He writes, "Frankly, the 24-hour brainwashing network CNN has gone over the edge. The terror bombing and mass killing have pushed CNN and many others into the state of mind of the man who, returning home to find his house has been robbed, takes out a shotgun and obliterates the neighbor's cat. Indeed, if his wife had said, 'Henry, it's just the neighbor's cat,' the maddened fellow would have threatened her, 'Don't get in my way or I might have to kill you too.' The United States has been surprised by a mass murderous attack from rogue forces deployed from within the USA itself, since no foreign power has the ability to do to us what was done this past Tuesday. Some rogue element operating within our military security establishment is the only possible principal author of what has just occurred. That mass murderous rogue is the burglar who is presently lurking from within the USA, preparing for his next strike, which he certainly intends to deliver soon. We must defend ourselves, our nation, against that rogue. Anything we do to shift the blame to foreign forces who were not capable of organizing Tuesday's attack simply makes our nation more vulnerable to the rogue from within who has just done this and is lurking ready to do more. And I start with that because people know what we did after 9/11. We went into a series of wars, including against Iraq, which had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. And I think Scott knows something about that. And we did not make the world safer. We made the world more dangerous. We've spoken with whistleblowers like Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe from the NSA, and we didn't get to the bottom of this. So now we have a situation where we are facing literally thermonuclear war. And I want to just say a couple things in background and dispense with a few of the myths or provide you with some evidence on the current strategic situation. So I'm just going to share screen here for a second. So first, this is Mr. LaRouche, and this function is extremely important because it's going on right now. Hyperinflation, this corner down here is about 1966, before the dollar was decoupled from gold, while we still had a physical productive economy. And what happened over these years, especially after the 71 policy change, is that we began looting our physical productive economy to create fictitious financial aggregates, including the stock market. If you look at what's happening right now in the UK with Liz Truss, she is going for a massive hyperinflationary overdrive. Now, Germany, not to be outdone, has announced, I think, 200 billion euros of energy subsidies. These things are not going to lower the prices. They're going to cause more inflation. But the point LaRouche made at one point is that a war, some people love a war because you get to write off all your debts. So if you somehow survive a nuclear Armageddon, then maybe you can get rid of this problem of the financial bubble. Now, what I want to show you next, for everyone who's not familiar, is just a map of the world. Here is Russia in the green, Ukraine, supposedly the orange. Of course, I noticed they left Crimea with Ukraine, which joined Russia some time ago, and we have the new referenda. But I just want people to have an idea. When you hear people in the West saying, oh, let's keep arming Ukraine, they're going to beat Russia. Even if you're Ukraine, we're not the most corrupt and looted nation in Europe. This is not a viable proposition, Ukraine beating Russia. And now these regions, and I'm sorry, I just had to find a map that was not copyrighted, so I'm not sure what language this is in. But if you take Ukraine, these are the areas where they just voted. Lugansk, Donetsk, which had decided actually some time ago to try and get a separate existence within Ukraine, large Russian-speaking population in those regions, and then below Zaporizhia and Kherson. All four of these areas just voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation. I think in Donetsk it was 99%, Luhansk 98%, Zaporizhia was I think 93%, and Kherson maybe 87%, something quite extraordinary, quite overwhelming. Why? Well, part of the reason is that for 8 years, Ukraine had been shelling at least Luhansk and Donetsk and killing thousands of its own people. This is a memorial to the children who were killed in that region, hundreds of children. It's called the Alley of the Angels. So all these people who say unprovoked aggression, et cetera, simply not the case. I'm going to share with you some of the insignia of why do we say neo-Nazi? What about Stepan Bandera? This is the Azov Battalion. And you see they are taking their logo from the Nazis. The black sun is a tattoo you'll see frequently on these soldiers, including, you should know, the Azov Battalion has just had a tour of the United States, meeting with members of the US Congress. Now, here is the map. This is only Nord Stream 2. It doesn't include Nord Stream 1, but I want you to see where it is so you can see how absurd it would be for 4 explosions to occur on this pipeline without anyone from the United States or NATO. Sweden just joined NATO, okay, having any awareness of this or knowing anything about it. And why Russia would be blamed. But of course, who is blaming Russia for it right now? CNN, exactly the entity that LaRouche identified in whipping everyone up to go to war all over the planet in the wake of 9/11. And why are some people saying that the United States is responsible for this? Well, here's a quote from a press conference, the 7th of February, 2022. President Biden, if Russia invades, then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it, the reporter said. But how will you do that exactly, since the project is in Germany's control? Biden, I promise you, we will be able to do that. So I wanted to just now share a couple other things, because the world is not hopeless, although the US and this unholy coalition with the UK and NATO has a lot of power to destroy things. Here is a picture from 2018, the BRICS conference. President Xi Jinping, President Modi of India, Ramaphosa of South Africa, Temer, I think, was the president of Brazil at the time, and Putin. These are 5 very big nations, very advanced technology. There's an even bigger group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They are getting off of this hyperinflationary Titanic. And the sanctions that we have imposed on Russia have only further consolidated the cooperation among these nations. It is truly the case that the United States is isolating itself, not everybody else. So with that, I'll just leave my introductory remarks. I wanted people to have a little background about where we are. And I think we'll go to Colonel Black, and then Scott, I know you're up on all the latest and can fill us in, and we can have some discussion. Colonel Black.
Thank you very much. Just to give you a little bit of my background. First of all, I'm not a left-wing anti-war activist. I served for 32 years in the military. I was a Marine helicopter pilot in Vietnam, flew 269 combat missions, came back with bullet holes through the plane on 4 missions. And then I was flying off the helicopter carrier Iwo Jima on Yankee Station off the Philippine Islands when there was a request brought down, and they said, look, we're looking for a volunteer. There's heavy combat going on with 1st Marine Division, and they need a forward air controller to serve on the ground. And I immediately volunteered. Following day, I was dropping bombs in conjunction with Alpha Company, 1st Marine Regiment, and was fully engaged. I made 70 very bloody combat patrols. I would be attached to whichever Marine infantry company was going into the assault. And on my last mission, we had attacked across the Hoi An River trying to rescue a Marine outpost. And during that attack, after we reached the far side of the Hoi An River, I was wounded, and both my radio men were killed right behind me. So I went on from there. I came back to the States. I was a helicopter flight instructor in H-46s, and then went on. Later, I was an engineer company commander, and went back to law school after that, and came back in as an Army JAG officer, and ran several large legal enterprises at Fort Leonard Wood, Fort Ord, and Fort Lewis, Washington, and then was at the Pentagon as chief of the Army's Criminal Law Division. So that was my background. And then when I got out, I was in legal practice, ran for office. I was in the House of Delegates, elected to 4 terms, and then elected to the Senate. In all, had 16 years of service to the state of Virginia, and I was widely considered the most conservative member of the General Assembly. I mentioned that in 2015, because of my expose of what was going on in Syria, I was one of 3 Americans who was designated as an enemy of ISIS, and they called me the American Crusader, which I thought was kind of nice. I appreciated them for doing that, while I didn't appreciate their wanting to kill me in the process. So in any event, that's a little bit of my background. Now, I recently wrote a letter to the United States Congress, and I was very concerned because for months, almost since the beginning of this war, there's been loose talk, both on the Democrat side and the Republican side, about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. And they talk about, well, we use some little nuclear weapons. And the most recent thing is we have a demand. Ukraine is always demanding that the rest of the world do different things. And there was a demand from Zelensky's senior aide, and his remarks were summarized by Newsweek, which ran this headline: U.S. needs to threaten Russia with nuclear strike, Ukraine. And basically what he was saying is that if Russia ever considered using nuclear weapons, that the Western powers should launch a swift retaliatory nuclear strike to destroy the nuclear launch sites in Russia. And now, a couple of things come out of it. First of all, it is impossible to limit a retaliatory nuclear strike such that it doesn't devastate a significant area, even if you use small nukes. But in any event, the problem with it is much larger than that, because as we grow closer and closer to the Russian border, the decision-making time for Russia becomes compressed more and more, to the point where their nuclear decisions have to almost be on autopilot, so that they can game out in advance what they will do if nuclear missiles are suddenly inbound. And I believe that Russia would be forced to respond to incoming missiles targeting their nuclear deterrence capability. I think they would be forced into an immediate, massive nuclear response, in which we would have the full panoply of weaponry used by the Russians. And there are Americans who say, well, you know, if we kind of snuck up on them, we could knock out a lot of their nuclear capability. The one thing that you got to remember, you cannot sneak up and knock out the nuclear submarines that Russia has. And they're very substantial. Each one carries roughly 100 thermonuclear warheads, individually targeted. So if you had a single Russian submarine lying somewhere off the coast of the United States, they could fire one salvo and literally incinerate the entire national capital region. The Capitol building would be gone. The White House would be gone. All of the famous monuments you see would be gone. There would be no remnant of them. The Pentagon would be targeted. It would be turned into thermonuclear radioactive glass. There would be nothing left alive. All of Northern Virginia with the CIA, with all of the military installation gone. They would target also the coastal areas. The Norfolk Navy Station would be gone. The great shipyards down there, the port of Norfolk, all of that would disappear. That's just one place. At the same time, there would be a Russian submarine that would target the industrial heart of Europe. And so we would see nuclear bombs, nuclear missiles showering down on Berlin, on Paris, on Brussels, on Rome, on capitals all across Central Europe. So we're getting into this area where we have this increasing one-upsmanship, this feeling that if Russia is going to get away with doing something in this little border dispute that they have with Ukraine, then we're going to show them we'll up the game to nuclear weapons. It's extremely dangerous. It's important for Americans to understand there was never a need for a single life to be lost in Ukraine. The decision to go to war was not made by Russia. The decision was made under the Obama administration when in 2014, the CIA, British MI6, staged a coup, a violent, murderous coup that overthrew the duly elected president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych. And we overthrew him, and we had people like Victoria Nuland, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She was literally, her communications were intercepted, where she was literally talking about who should and should not be in the incoming Ukrainian government. She was doing this at this very time that she was still negotiating with Yanukovych while he was still the president. So she was doing this very duplicitous thing, negotiating, trying to fool him into making some mistakes. At the same time, she was setting up a revolutionary government. As soon as the US managed to stage the coup and overthrow the government, we then began surging billions of dollars of advanced weapons in so that we could build up a very, very large Ukrainian army trained and equipped to fight Russians. So it didn't have to happen. We had multiple opportunities. Germany and France were very concerned about what was going on. They set up the Minsk peace agreements, and they brought the parties together, the parties that were fighting at the time, and Ukraine agreed. They signed and they agreed under Minsk that they would give limited autonomy to the Donbass, and it would put an end to all of the hostilities. But then Boris Johnson unexpectedly flew to Kiev, and he blew up the whole deal, and he prevented peace from coming about. And he would not have done that without the coordination and approval of the US State Department. So it is true that Russia came across the border in February this year. It is not true that they caused or started the war. The war had been going on since 2014 with aggression by Ukraine against the Donbass, where they had killed about 14,000 people over the 7 years leading up to the eventual intervention of the Russians. So the American people have been very badly misled by this. It is now causing enormous economic disruptions around the world, and even talk of nuclear war. We've got to put an end to this. We've got to make it clear that we will not accept nuclear war for some border dispute that's going on the other side of the world, with a country that is not a vital national interest of the United States.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And we'll have take some questions and discussion, which people can put in the YouTube chat at the end. Now, Scott, I'm sure I've heard you recently and your guest yesterday. You probably have a lot to say on where we are, what your assessment of the situation is. And if you have an idea of how we can get out of this mess, I'd like to hear that as well.
Well, first of all, again, Diane, thanks for inviting me. And I just want to, again, express my appreciation for Colonel Black and his service to our nation. I'm honored to be in your presence and in your company, sir. I mean, my background isn't nearly as distinguished. I did join the Marine Corps. I will say this, and this has relevance to the question you asked. I'm a child of the Cold War, and in every sense of the word. My father was a career Air Force officer. He did, served in Vietnam, was involved in the Pueblo response, and we were stationed in the 1970s in Turkey. My father was part of the advisory group there. And why I bring that up is Turkey was on the border with the Soviet Union. I mean, we were literally on the front line of the Cold War. To live in Turkey in the 1970s, you lived in a nation where the United States operated covert signals intelligence stations, listening in on Russian communications. Just down the road from us was a facility that monitored seismic activity from Russian or Soviet nuclear weapons testing. We had Merted, which was a nuclear weapons storage facility where we had nuclear bombs that would be given to the Turks in time of war so they could fly nuclear missions against the Soviet threat. So this is very much the front line of the Cold War. And believe me, as a teenager, I was very cognizant of what was going on. Everybody did. We talked about what our fathers did. And it was sort of, it was just I want to say an exciting time, because as a teenager, you don't fully understand the ramifications of nuclear conflict. All you know is that you're caught up in this Cold War mystique of us versus them, good versus bad. Then we moved to Germany. And Germany in the late 1970s was, the US military was in a period of post-Vietnam transition. And you watched around you. We literally 2 times a year, Germany would come alive with tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, as exercises were carried out to prepare for the eventuality of war with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was literally right across the border. Right across the border. One of the places we lived in, Marnheim, right next to us, was a US nuclear weapons storage facility. North Point, they called it. And we all knew what was in North Point. We weren't supposed to talk about it because we don't call it. But there they are. And we also knew that if the balloon went up, we all died that quick because the nukes would be hit. And this is a time when my father, every once in a while, would disappear without notice into the bunker. The bunker, of course, being the command post that everybody went down in when crisis happened. The bunker could survive a nuclear attack. Home couldn't. And your dad would disappear. You'd have to get on the bus and go to school. And on the way to school, you'd watch all the tanks and the airplanes move around, and you're going, am I coming home? And then when you finally made it home, you'd literally go, am I going to wake up in the morning? Literally, these are the things that you're saying as a teenager. The reality of this was real. Berlin. I went to Berlin several times. It was an occupied city. Taking the train from West Berlin into, from West Germany into Berlin. The train would stop when you went across the borders, and the Soviets would come in with their guard dogs and everything, check your paperwork. Driving from Checkpoint Alpha to Checkpoint Bravo. If you went on that highway and you didn't check in on time, they would send out machine gun jeeps looking for you. Airplanes flying the corridor, the same corridors that were established during the Berlin airlift in the 1940s. You fly. I did all 3 of those going into Berlin, and there they were, the Soviets, staring back at you. And man, I tell you what, I wanted to join the military when I graduated high school. I wanted to join the military for the sole purpose of closing with and destroying the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver. Kill a commie for mommy, I believe that. Better read than dead. You're darn right. I mean, this was serious stuff. Those were the bad guys. We were the good guys, and I lived it. I grew up. Well, everybody else has learned how to tune cars and chase girls in the United States. I'm literally living under the shadow of imminent nuclear demise. I wanted to be a part of that. So I did. I joined the Army out of high school, went to West Point Prep. Long story short, me and the Army didn't see eye to eye. So I got out of the Army and went to college and got my commission in the Marine Corps, which was more to my liking. Post-Vietnam War, United States Army wasn't my cup of tea. Marine Corps was. And I was also, talk about political inclination. Ronald Reagan, Republican, man, died in the wool, Ronald Reagan guy. First president I ever voted for, Ronald Reagan. I almost got kicked out of college because the day Reagan was shot, I was down in the student union, and one of those long-haired hippies said, I hope they killed the guy. And I put him up against the wall, punched his face in, had to be pulled off, go to the dean, and they threatened to kick me out of college, and I threatened to call the Secret Service and say, what are you doing about a man who's threatening the life of the United States president? Why do you allow people to speak about the commander-in-chief that way? So we reached a compromise. I promised not to punch anybody in the face anymore. They promised not to kick me out of school. But I graduated as a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan Republican, joined the Marine Corps, where I spent the next couple of years learning how to kill Soviets. Literally, that's all we did. In 29 Palms, California, we trained day and night to kill Soviets. I was in a field artillery unit. My one of the more frustrating things was carrying out the big exercise. So I'm up in the command post, and exercise going well is exercise in Iran. The Soviets were coming in. We're supposed to block them from reaching the warm water ports. And we're moving Marine units on the map, and there's always more Russians than there are us. And eventually they break through 1st Marine Division, and they're moving in on Chabahar. So in comes 5th Battalion, 11th Marines. We pull up the self-propelled 155 millimeter howitzer, load in the nuclear shell, boom, fire off the nuke, bam, we stop the Russian division. Next thing we know, they said, index, exercise is over. I said, well, what happened? They said, oh, the Soviets retaliated, we're all dead, exercise is over. And that was sort of the first wake-up call about the terminal impact of nuclear war. Index, it's all over. There's nothing left to talk about. Just clean it up, go home, you're all dead. That was a wake-up call. So I spent, a long time trying to figure out how to survive in a nuclear environment. Bottom line is you can't survive. Once the nukes go off, everybody dies. In 1987, Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Mikhail Gorbachev. And because I studied Russian history and Russian language in college, playing football and drinking beer at the same time, so my language wasn't that good. But they handpicked me to be part of a Department of Defense activity called the On-Site Inspection Agency. I was a first lieutenant, which is very junior, in an agency where the next junior person was a senior major. The average rank was lieutenant colonel, and colonels were a dime a dozen. I get thrown in as a first lieutenant, and somehow I've managed to finagle my way into being the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union when the treaty was being implemented. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is the 1980s were a very dangerous time. I talked about growing up. I talked about being in the Marine Corps. I talked about the imminent threat of nuclear weapons. It was real, especially in the form of intermediate nuclear range missiles. These missiles, the Soviets had a large number of them, and there was a huge crisis in the 1980s when the United States decided to deploy its own intermediate nuclear range missiles, the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missile, in response to the Soviet developments of a missile called the SS-20. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was going to get rid of all of them. I'm not talking about arms control, limiting the numbers, all of them. In one fell swoop, an entire category of weapons that literally threatened humanity because we were on a razor's edge, ready to go to war in Europe. One mistake, Colonel Black mentioned the timelines. Pershing II fired from West German soil, impacts Moscow in 7 minutes. There's not too much decision-making to be done in 7 minutes. It is launch, fire, everything goes. It's not, will we have a tailored response? Will we see what they're hitting? Can we come up with, can we escalate to de-escalate? All this garbage that think tanks come up with. They talk about nuclear conflict. It really doesn't work that way. It literally is a missile coming in, hit the button, fire everything, get it all out, and destroy the world. Because that's what deterrence is. Deterrence isn't about negotiating down the consequences of nuclear war. Deterrence is, if you ever use a nuclear weapon against me, I will destroy you and everything on this earth. Therefore, don't use a nuclear weapon against me. And yet we both had them, and they were both forward deployed. In 1983, we had an exercise called Able Archer, and Able Archer tested the nuclear launch command and control of NATO nuclear forces. But the Soviets were watching it saying, I think they're really going to launch a preemptive nuclear strike. So they put their entire SS-20 missile force on alert, ready to fire at a moment's notice. And had there been a hiccup, one little hiccup in Able Archer, the SS-20s would have launched. And that would have been it. All she wrote, Europe's gone, everybody's gone. We got rid of those. It was a wonderful thing to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction. You talked about today, people, like you mentioned, people coming up and saying, hey, maybe we can launch something and sneak it in on them. Let me tell you about a little incident that took place while I was an inspector. We had what we called a crisis, a missile crisis. We had a giant X-ray machine. And the Soviets ended up shipping out 3 missiles that they didn't want X-ray. I won't get into it. You can read my book about it if you want to learn the background. But these 3 missiles went out. And, long story short is they left the factory without being X-rayed. As soon as they left, we were able to get the X-ray machine up. And everybody's scratching their head going, why? Why would they do this? What is the purpose of sending it out? Turns out that those 3 missiles were the final shipment of a series of missiles that looked like SS-25s, but they weren't. They were missiles called the Sare. The Sare, you see, carries a communications package instead of a warhead. And the Sare goes to a regiment that continuously keeps missiles in the field. And what is the purpose of Sare? It's tied to a system called the dead hand perimeter. You see, if the United States thinks for a second it can launch a debilitating attack against Russia, let's say we got lucky and we took out Putin and all of his command and control. The dead hand actually has sensors around, sensors that monitor seismic activity, sensors that monitor radioactive fallout, sensors that monitor the lack of communications, meaning that if people aren't checking in on time continuously, then what happens? The dead hand, called the dead hand because everybody could dead and it's still going to go off. The dead hand fires Sare missiles, and the Sare missiles fly over the Soviet Union, sending out launch codes, and everything is launched automatically. Guys, there's no such thing as a surprise attack. There's no such thing as a surprise attack. You can't win a nuclear conflict. You can't. It's simply impossible to do. But here we are today. We're in a situation, something happened today. I don't know if people, I hope Americans are able to cut through the propaganda and stuff and listen to Russian President Vladimir Putin's speech that he gave today on the occasion of incorporating 4 former Ukrainian territories into Russia. I'm not going to sit here and be Putin's shill. I just want people to listen to the speech and understand the seriousness of what he's saying. And you don't have to agree with him. You can disagree vehemently about the decision to incorporate these territories, but listen to what he says about relations between Russia and the West and understand that we are literally on the edge of the abyss. And it's a very dangerous situation. All those missiles that we got rid of in the 1980s, the success of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, it's been undone. The United States, of course, withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2019. It no longer exists. We're talking about deploying these weapons. We have usable nukes now, the W76-2 low-yield nuclear warhead that we've mounted on Trident missiles, on Trident submarines. They exist for the sole purpose of giving the commander-in-chief, that's the president, flexibility to tailor a response to any Russian action that may occur. That means tailor a nuclear response. So this notion that the United States has signed a joint statement with the other 4 permanent nuclear powers, being France, United Kingdom, Russia, and China, that nuclear war can't be won, therefore nuclear wars should never be fought. I mean, that's the statement. Everybody signed it, shook it, and yet we develop weapons that are by design to be used in a non-nuclear environment, that we will use nuclear weapons preemptively. That's what the W76-2 is. The first time it was tested, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, I believe, went to Omaha, where he initiated the command and control simulating the launch of a W76-2 against Russian forces. Normally we launch against, northern, beef jerkyistan, or we would come up with some sort of weird name for the fake enemy. We weren't faking it. It was Russia. We're launching a nuke against Russia. Not because Russia nuked us, because Russia had broken through and was threatening to, advance on Poland and the Baltic. So we used nukes to stop them. Insanity. But that's what defines this current situation, insanity. Right now, you hear a lot of talk in the West that Russia is losing this conflict, that Russia is lost, that the reason why they're mobilizing 300,000 troops is proof positive that they've suffered overwhelming casualties, that their military is not as competent as we thought it was. All I ask for people to reflect on that is, if the Russian military is so incompetent, why did Russia just absorb 20% of Ukraine? I don't think that's the end result of an incompetent military. The other thing is the Ukrainian military, and everybody in NATO knows this, has suffered crippling casualties. The number of casualties that have been incurred, the Russians recently reduced the number of 61,000. I think that's a low ball, especially given the current offensive. I think that number is closer to 80,000 dead, not casualties, dead. And then you take the wounded, the Russian figure of 40,000 is a little low. Normally, one would expect like 2 to 3 times as many wounded as you have dead, except it reflects the reality of the battlefield. Russia so dominates the battlefield, and the Ukrainian command and control is so incompetent that many Ukrainian soldiers who otherwise would survive are left to die on the battlefield. And that's just a harsh reality. So anybody who talks about America and Europe standing up for the Ukrainian people or standing up for Ukraine, understand that we are empowering a government that doesn't care about its troops, that literally sacrifices them needlessly on the front, not to serve Ukraine's interests, but to serve the interests of the United States and NATO in containing and subduing Russia. But Russia is not going to allow itself to be contained. It's not going to be subdued. But there's a lot of talk now that this mobilization is an act of desperation, that if Russia is to go on the offensive, Russia will have to use tactical nuclear weapons to punish Ukraine and to break the will of the Ukrainians. So now the United States and NATO are desperately saying, well, what do we do? What do we do if the Russians nuke? Let's back up for a second. Russia published a nuclear doctrine in 2020 that says nuclear weapons can be used on one of 2 conditions. First condition is if nuclear weapons are fired against Russia, or if Russia detects the launch of nuclear weapons that are more than likely going to hit Russia, releases everything, the world ends. As Putin says, you're dead, we're martyrs, we go to heaven. You go wherever you go. But that's it. The second one is if the national survival of the state is put at risk. Now, that's a broad term, national survival. What is the survival of the Russian state? I think the Russians have made it clear that these 4 new territories have been incorporated in Russia. Any effort to forcefully recapture these territories threatens the national survival of the state, and Russia will use whatever means necessary to prevent that. But it doesn't mean that Russia is going to automatically go nuclear. I had an interview the other day with a very interesting gentleman, Andrei Burulov. He's a former general in the Russian military. Currently, he's a parliamentarian, and he's said to have Putin's ear. And he made it clear. He said, "We will never use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Our nuclear arsenal was never devised to be used against Ukraine. There's no scenario in which we would use nuclear weapons against Ukraine." Implicit in that is that Ukraine in and of by itself could never threaten Russia, meaning there's no chance that Ukraine alone could ever reconquer Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. Ukraine, in concert with NATO, could pose a threat. But if that's the case, the problem isn't Ukraine, the problem is NATO. And that the nuclear strike wouldn't be against Kiev, the nuclear strike would be against London, Paris, Berlin. And he was dead serious about this, saying, no, if NATO gets involved, we take NATO out. But then he said something that's curious, because now we come into, why would Russia think that that is something that's survivable? He said, we are convinced that the United States would never go to strategic nuclear conflict if we nuked NATO. We're convinced of that. Why would he be convinced of that? Because the United States and NATO, in coming up with the myth of a Russian nuclear attack against Ukraine, have come up with alternatives that say, if Russia nukes Ukraine, we will respond with catastrophic damage in a non-nuclear way. We've taken nukes off the table when we talk about responding to a Russian nuclear strike against Ukraine because we don't have a doctrine to deal with that. Ukraine's not NATO. They're not part of the Article 5 protection. So what happens if Russia nukes Ukraine? Our nuclear umbrella doesn't apply. So instead, we talk about catastrophic impact. We're going to take out infrastructure. Newsweek magazine even hinted that we would carry out a decapitation strike against the Russian leadership, targeting Putin himself with non-nuclear means. Let's take the absurdity and insanity of that away for a second. What does that tell the Russians? If we use a tactical nuke, there will not be a nuclear response. But the Russians are misreading because it's if we use a tactical nuke against Ukraine, there won't be a nuclear response. But if Russia attacks NATO, then US doctrine comes in full play. The doctrine is quite clear that if there's a nuclear attack against an ally or partner, then we will respond with overwhelming force to punish those who carried out the attack. So the Russians are wrong. We're wrong. The Russians are wrong. We both are operating in a sea of ignorance at a time when tensions and passions are so high. Mistakes are going to be made. Miscalculations are going to be made. And I'm concerned now, we have to wait and see what Stoltenberg and the United Nations Secretary General are about to say, but I'm concerned that NATO, having been confronted with a very aggressive posture by Russia, is going to respond with a very aggressive posture that could be misinterpreted by Russia as representing a threat to the homeland, to the motherland. The President Biden has just come out and said that we will support Ukraine's effort to reconquer these territories. Okay, that is literally a declaration of war. That is literally a suicide pact. I mean, we're gone beyond Russian roulette. You know, Russian roulette is a simple game. It's a revolver, 6 chambers. You put a bullet in, you spin the chamber, click. Wow, how brave are you? But at least you have a 1 in 5 chance of, or a 5 to 1 chance of surviving. But what the game that, Biden's playing now is straight out of the Deer Hunter. We're not doing 1 bullet. We're not doing 2, 3. No, Biden's going to put 6 rounds in the chamber, spin it, and blow his brains out. That's the direction we're heading. This is called Biden roulette. This is stupidity. This is insanity. And I am scared to death, literally scared to death, because I know I've lived this. I lived this life. I was ready to go to nuclear war. I participated in nuclear disarmament, and I've been involved in nuclear disarmament my entire adult life. I know the reality of nuclear war. I know the decision-making involved in it. I know the checks and balances that are supposed to exist to prevent it. And we have stripped those bare. We are dealing with fake doctrine on both sides. We just manufacture doctrine for the other person. We empower ourselves with capabilities because we don't believe the other side's serious, and we're going to call each other's bluff until it's too late, and then the world ends. And I wrote an article for Consortium News last week, and I basically said that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they have the doomsday clock, and the doomsday clock hovers between 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. I said, let's start being honest and put it to 1 second. We are 1 second away from midnight. And every American that goes to bed tonight should understand you may not wake up in the morning. This is real. This is as real as it gets. This is about, if you're in my situation, planning my daughter's wedding. My daughter ain't going to have a wedding if this happens. I want to go to the garlic festival tomorrow. There may not be a tomorrow. I want to do a lot of things. It ain't going to happen, guys. The world is going to come to an end if we don't find a way to inject some sanity and reason into this situation. And Colonel Black hit it on the head. A border dispute halfway across the world that has no direct bearing on the national survival, national security of the United States of America should not be a suicide pact. We should not be willing to sacrifice the well-being of Americans. And let's stop speaking selfishly. Let's sacrifice the well-being of the entire planet because we have a politician who doesn't have the courage to do the right thing. And we haven't even talked, Diane, about Nazis, and I'm not going to go down that path because I get really, really, really mad. But the fact that we're going to commit global suicide on behalf of an ideology we should have violently eradicated 7 decades ago, but somehow we've allowed to be reborn in Europe is likewise a disturbing thing. But I've gone on too long. I'll turn the table back to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. I just want to bring up a couple of things. I mean, obviously, this insanity is the reason why I decided to run against all odds against Schumer. And the Congress can be moved. We saw that there was a response from Representative Gosar on the kill list. I think every single person hearing this should mobilize your rear end off, because there is a constitution in this country and this can be halted. But I also don't want to diminish what Scott said in terms of the danger. It is very real, and we are dealing with a serious factor of insanity. Now, there's some interesting flanks. One is in a column or on the site Nachdenkseiten by Albrecht Müller, who was an advisor to previous chancellors in Germany. He writes the following, which is very interesting. It is not yet 100% certain that the USA is behind the sabotage of the 2 Baltic Sea pipelines, but the evidence and interest speak for it. Are we actually aware of what that would mean? Our main ally, whom most Germans and official Germany consider a friend in politics and the media, is destroying the transport route for our most important energy supply, and with it, an important base of industrial activity in our country. To permanently weaken an industrial competitor in Europe, to withdraw industrial companies from Germany to the USA. He said, to document that the US claims to be the only world power, we should be clear about what that means. That would be the termination of a friendship. Our problem is the USA. You have also ensured that the understanding with Russia is torpedoed. Millions of Germans will suffer as a result. I think another potential way that this could go, this latest crime, the sabotage of the pipelines, I think also has the potential to backfire very badly, as many of the insane policies coming from the UK, NATO, British intelligence, CIA, etc., are doing. And Colonel Black, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and also anything on what you heard from Scott.
Yeah, I would certainly echo everything that Scott says. He is perhaps the preeminent expert that we have on nuclear disarmament, nuclear risks, and the reality of that situation. So I certainly got a great deal out of it myself. I want to talk about Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1. These are the two vital pipelines for Russian gas to flow to Europe. It is Russian gas that is the foundation of the German industrial state. The chemical industry, it's kind of an amazing thing. There's something called the Haber process, in which natural gas is combined with nitrogen from the air, and basically you have natural gas, air, and water, and you end up with fertilizer. And then you convert various ammonia fertilizers and products, and you create this enormous chain of chemicals. So the foundation for the industrial economic strength of all of Europe. Europe is dependent on German in industry and technology, and Germany is dependent for its competitiveness on Russian gas. It's a great deal for Germany. It's a great deal for Russia, but the United States doesn't like it. We have a very powerful industry of shipping liquefied natural gas from the United States and exporting it. And I think it's a great thing that we have it, so long as we sell it into an open market. But I think one of the significant objectives of the United States in promoting this war with Russia in Ukraine was to kill off the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline and to enhance our ability to sell liquefied natural gas into Europe. Now, these two pipelines were both destroyed using very powerful amounts of explosives. This was not something where you take out a small explosive charge and detonate it. They were somewhere around 230 feet below the ocean. So you're at the very, very ultimate edge of the ability of ordinary divers to go down. In order to do something of this magnitude, I think as a prosecutor, I was a career prosecutor. So you look at motive, means, and opportunity. Who has the means to destroy those pipelines? Probably Ukraine does not have them unless we somehow provide them. But so they don't have the ability to do it. They don't really have the opportunity to do it. Who has the motive? The motive. No nation has the motive to destroy those pipelines more so than the United States. And you can tell from the statements you showed of the president that he made it clear that we had a determination to destroy those pipelines. Now, I can't imagine. Now there are other nations that had a motive to destroy the pipelines. Perhaps Poland would be one, but I cannot imagine that any NATO country would destroy the pipelines without coordination with the United States. They just wouldn't do it. So while I don't have any proof, I just look at the likelihood. I've dealt with thousands of criminal cases, and typically I'll tell the CID or the FBI or the British bobbies, and I'll say, okay, I've got a hunch this is what we need to look for, and they go out, and often it proves correct. My hunch is that the United States did it, and the motive for it is quite clear. What's happening in Europe today is that the people have never really been consulted on the idea of sanctions on Ukrainian products, which the sanctions really are sanctions on Europe. They're, yes, they cut off a market for Russia, but they cut off access to the resources to Europe. And so people are getting very restless, and people are starting to protest. And I think part of the objective was, let's just destroy these pipelines so that if people protest and they try to overthrow governments so that they will turn back on the Russian gas and the cold in the winter, won't help, because the pipelines don't work anyway. And I think ultimately that is the objective. And anybody who trusts the Central Intelligence Agency to do what is in the best interest of the American people, blowing smoke. They are smoking dope, because their interest is in the boys from Davos, the World Economic Forum, all of the globalists who are linked together, who have enormous profits at stake. If we by breaking up Ukraine, they're going to rush in, they're going to buy resources at a nickel on the dollar, and they want to do the same thing with Russia. So I am most uneasy that the Central Intelligence Agency and DOD, State Department, have coordinated and destroyed those pipelines. That's speculation, but I think it's a pretty good guess.
Thanks. So we're going to have to wrap up in about 11 minutes, but Scott, I want your thoughts on this. And also, given what you were involved in with the inspections, and you're welcome to please promote your book, can we step back? I mean, what would you if suddenly we had a different administration, different presidency, what would you propose that we do?
Well, let's just start off with energy security for a second. I think the United States and its allies have shown without a shadow of a doubt that they are clueless about global energy markets and energy security. We thought we could sanction a nation we derisively called a gas station disguised as a nation state. But the absurdity of sanctioning the preeminent energy power in the world, and I say that with all seriousness, Saudi Arabia is not. Saudi Arabia services Western interests with their ability to increase and lower oil production to suit American consumer and market needs. Russia services the world. Russia is a global provider and understands every aspect, every facet of energy security and the ins and outs of energy production, and energy supply. And so for the United States and Europe to have the audacity to think that they're going to sanction Russian energy as part of a packet to destroy Russia was just bad thinking. Russia flipped the script, and it's the United States and primarily Europe that's paying the price today. The destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is literally in the same way. I'm with Colonel Black on this one, sir. You know that people can be convicted on circumstantial evidence alone, and I have never seen a stronger circumstantial case than this one. You have a confession, a de facto confession from the President of the United States and from Victoria Nuland. So intent is already taken. Intent's 9/10 of the problem when it comes to prosecuting a case of this nature. So if we were to take Joe Biden to an international criminal court, I think he could be convicted of an act of international terrorism, which is what this is. But the idea that this was a smart move, a good policy move, is absurd. Two things. One, all you've done is guarantee that at some point in time, because the truth will out, truth will come out. And when it does, there will be horrific consequences for the United States and Europe. We may have presaged a divorce of Europe from the United States, which, to be honest, might not be a bad thing. But the other thing is, if you think Nord Stream 2 was vulnerable, what do you think American LNG is? What do you think Norwegian gas is? At the same time they blew up Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, they opened up the pipeline connecting Norway with Poland, supplying gas to Poland, and Poland declared it was free of Russian gas. If Russia wanted to play this game, Russia could very easily shut down everything, and we would never know. I mean, we'd suspect it, but at least Putin's not going to go out and confess the crime ahead of time. The fact is, LNG is extremely vulnerable. The tankers, you sink 2 tankers, the entire fleet shuts down because no insurer will ever insure them again. The same thing with Norwegian gas. That pipeline could be taken out in any number of ways. And anybody who does business, energy business, knows this, which is why I know that nobody with any acumen in international energy security advised the President of the United States. This was purely stupid politics. This was the American president trying to look tough. You asked the question, is there hope? The book, and I'll give it a short plug, it's called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. It provides a window into 3 incredible years where the United States and the Soviet Union transformed from enemies, where one was called the evil empire and the other one was called the enemy number one. And we came together and we, in a cooperative fashion, and we made the world a safer place to live. It was like Camelot for a moment. It was perfect. It quickly went away. But George Santayana, American philosopher, said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. Now, that implies that every lesson of history is negative. I would like to twist that a little bit. Those who fail to learn from the successes of history are condemned never to have success. The INF Treaty is a template of success. Arms control is the future. The only way the United States and Russia backs out of this is with meaningful arms control, to take nuclear weapons off the table. Once you take nuclear weapons off the table, common sense can then be injected into the dialogue. People can start figuring out how to cooperate, maybe not as friends. I don't think there's enough trust between the two nations especially given what we've done to Russia, for friendship or partnership to be injected. But I do believe that we can live in peaceful coexistence. I do believe that we can live in relative harmony in a world that would be free of the tyranny of a nuclear apocalypse. Arms control is the key. My book provides a template for how that worked in the past and how it can work again in the future.
Thanks. Colonel Black, any closing thoughts?
Well, I just I hope that that as winter comes, the people of Europe will wake up. They'll realize that they have been taken on a wild venture that is suicidal for them, for their economy at least. And I hope that the American people will begin to recognize that, like so many of our military endeavors, this was a setup from the beginning. The Russians attacked, but the war had been going on for 7 years when the Russians attacked. The war, Ukraine had been waging war against the Russian-speaking areas of the Donbass. And I will tell you, Russia is not a nation that's prepared to be an imperial power. Everyone talks about, the Russian Empire. Let me tell you something. The United States right now has about 750 military bases. The UK has another 145 military bases outside of their country. These are foreign military bases. You know how many Russia has? 35. And these are remnants of the old Soviet Union. How about China? China has 5 overseas military bases, and you compare that with almost 900 between the US and Great Britain. So we are not being threatened, but we are, this idea, this constant militarism is not helpful to the American people. And I hope we can see a significant shift in direction in the near future.
Well, thank you both very much for participating in this discussion, helping to shed light on this. I would urge everyone who is listening to sign up to volunteer with my campaign, and also get to your representatives. It is very real. What Scott said earlier, it is very real. There are no guarantees that we're going to survive this. And if you look at the current behavior of some of our leadership, it looks very bad, like we won't survive it, because they seem to be beyond delusional and pompous. And I would like to remind everyone, the mission of the United States was not to be an empire. We had a revolution against the British Empire for a reason. John Quincy Adams, his idea of our relationship to Russia, the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, led by Americans, the kind of cooperation and backup that Russia provided during the Civil War when Britain and France were in danger of recognizing the Confederacy, and Russia sent the Navy to both coasts and said, if you join the war, to those European nations, if you join the war on the side of the Confederacy, we're going to join on the side of the Union, or we're going to attack you in Europe too. And then not so long ago, who were our partners in defeating Nazism 77 years ago? So it's urgent that Americans come to their senses. And if people have more questions for Scott and Colonel Black, send them my way, or you can find them on various channels. It's getting more difficult because of the censorship, but I know Scott is on Telegram and YouTube frequently, and Colonel Black is also very visible. So thank you both very much, and let's win this.
Thank you.